Okay, we're back on the record on case CR 22-21-1623, State of Idaho versus Chad Daybell. The state's getting prepared to call its next witness. Because I will likely forget to mention this before we call the witness, just a scheduling matter, I'd like to advise the court, everyone here and the jurors as well. Tomorrow, there are some courthouse renovations taking place that are probably going to be pretty distracting when that happens. So we've had a request to stop trial tomorrow at 2:00. So we'll talk about a schedule possibly with a shorter lunch tomorrow going through, but we'll need to conclude by 2 tomorrow. So that will be the schedule. And then we'll have likely another just normal day on Friday. So apologies for doing that at a strange time. And again, I don't think I'll remember to do that otherwise. At this time, the state, I believe, Ms. Blake, you're going to be directing the next witness. Is that correct?
That is correct, Your Honor.
Go ahead and call your witness, please.
The state will call Detective Werther.
Will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth to help you God.
Okay, thank you.
All right, I'll note Detective Werther's now been placed under oath. I do have a couple of questions before we commence. Detective Werther, have you listened in on online or in person here any of the trial testimony that's taken place since this case started?
I have not.
Have you talked to anyone else about testimony they've provided in this trial?
I spoke to Detective Duncan. I'm aware that he did testify, but we didn't discuss the content of his testimony.
Okay. All right. Ms. Blake, then you may proceed with your direct.
Thank you, Your Honor. Will you please state your name again and spell it for the record?
Yes. My name is Ariel Werther. Ariel spelled A-R-I-E-L. Werther spelled W-E-R-T-H-E-R. My badge number is 649, and I work for the Chandler Police Department.
What is your current title or position within the Chandler Police Department?
The title is detective. I'm assigned to the robbery homicide unit of the Chandler Police Department.
Do you have any specialized training in order to be a law enforcement officer in general?
Yes, I attended the Arizona Law Enforcement Academy 2011. Prior to that, I worked as a dispatcher for the department for 3 years. And then since that time, I've engaged in ongoing training as required by AZ Post, which is the outfit that determines if a person is and can remain a sworn law enforcement officer in Arizona. I've also sought additional specialized training for the various units that I've worked in, including training relevant to what I'm testifying here today.
And you just talked about some of them, but have you held various assignments or positions within the Chandler Police Department?
I have. So initially I began, as I mentioned, as a police dispatcher with a civilian position, answering 911, dispatching police officers, things like that. That was in 2008. In 2011, I transitioned and became a sworn law enforcement officer, went to the academy. I worked on patrol for a total of 5 years. During 2 of those years, I was a field training officer, which would be a person who trains new officers in the job in the field. And then I transitioned to working as a detective for the Special Victims Unit, investigating primarily sex crimes and family violence cases. And then that was in 2016. In 2020, I transitioned to working for the Robbery Homicide Unit, and I've been there since.
And then you referenced some training regarding what you're testifying to today. Can you tell me a little bit about what that training was or is?
I've attended multiple training events regarding the interpretation of cell phone records specifically, including 2 40-hour courses, one of which I attended earlier this year. And that provides training and guidance and practical experience, including projects that one works on in the class in order to properly interpret data received from cell phone service providers. And then I've also had training on interpreting data extracted from mobile devices.
So focusing on that training with the cell phones, can you explain how a cell phone communicates with cell towers?
A mobile device on a cellular network would typically be serviced by a particular provider. That provider has a network of base stations or cell towers. We've all seen them as we move throughout the city and other places. Those have radio frequency antenna mounted to them that angle in particular directions and broadcast and receive signals that keep your mobile device communicating with the network. And typically, if you are moving about, it may be the case that your device may begin connected to a particular cell tower, but then do what's known as a handoff and transition to a different cellular tower on the same network in order to provide what feels to us like an uninterrupted experience as it moves from one tower to the next.
And do you use call detail records to get information about a cell phone as well?
We do.
What is a call detail record?
Call detail records is a generic term for the records maintained by your cellular service provider that they maintain for their own purposes, for business purposes, and that log things such as when a particular mobile device connected to a tower, for what purpose. If it's a voice call, typically it'll say, the length of that call. And if it's a text message, it'll typically tell you things such as whether that's an incoming or an outgoing text message and what other phone numbers were involved in that communication.
How does law enforcement obtain call detail records?
Typically via a search warrant based upon probable cause and authorized by a judge, which is then served to the cellular service provider, and then they will produce the records ordered by that judge.
Were you working in Chandler, Arizona on July 11th of 2019?
I was.
Did you end up responding out to a call regarding a shooting?
I did.
Were you the lead investigator at that time?
I was not.
What were your responsibilities? Well, let me back up. Did you learn who the victim of that shooting was?
Yes,
And who was that?
that was Charles Vallow.
Were you assigned certain roles or responsibilities on July 11th of 2019?
I was.
What were those?
They were minimal at that time. As I mentioned before, I joined the robbery homicide team in 2020, so I was not on the team at this point. And as this was a fatal shooting investigation, that's the team that would respond out. I was at that time still in Special Victims Unit, but I had made no secret of the fact that I intended to test for the robbery homicide team in the near future. So as a matter of succession planning, I was invited to come out on various incidents that would be good training opportunities for me to see how the investigation was conducted. All of that is to say that much of my time at the scene was actually observing and not actually directly handling any particular responsibility.
At some point, were you given cell phone location data to review and analyze?
I was.
Do you know whose cell phone data that was?
Yes.
And whose was it?
That was data extracted from a device belonging to Charles Vallow.
As part of your role in the investigation, did you review phone or call detail records in relation to other phones?
I did.
Do you recall the various providers that you looked at records from?
Yes.
And who were those?
Those were T-Mobile, Verizon, and AT&T.
Do the records from all of the providers look the same?
They do not.
And can you explain a little bit about how they differ?
Each provider has their own, because again, these are maintained for their business records. They're not, law enforcement doesn't instruct them what data they have to keep. We can merely access the data that they do have. So each company has a different approach to how they maintain their data for their own purposes. Some are in spreadsheets, some are in text documents, some are multiple spreadsheets, some are much more consolidated. We take the data as they have it and analyze what they give us.
And in this case, were you the officer that drafted any of the search warrants for these call records?
No,
Did somebody else draft the search warrants?
that's right.
And then you were provided the data, the responsive data to analyze?
That's correct.
And did that include analyzing GPS?
It did include analyzing GPS location data, which was extracted from Charles Vallow's phone.
Is it fair to call the call detail records raw data?
Yes,
And do you use a program to analyze that data once you have it?
yes. The Chandler Police Department has access to a program called Trax, formerly under a company called ZX, but they've transitioned to a company called LexisNexis. But the tool is a data analysis tool that we're able to use to analyze raw records that we are given by the companies.
And can you explain a little bit about how that program interprets the data to get a location of a cell phone?
Yes, you were, as mentioned previously, your device connects to various towers as you use voice, data, text, whatever you may be using. And we request and obtain from the providers locations of the towers and details about the tower. Typically, a tower is going to have multiple sectors. So while you have one tower, ordinarily that tower has antenna facing in sectors divided up to provide 360-degree coverage. The data they provide indicates the azimuth, which is a fancy term for the 360-degree angle if you were looking down on the tower from above, that particular sector is facing, and then they provide the GPS location of where that tower is located in the world. And the call detail records will typically indicate when a particular communication event took place, which tower it connected to, and which sector. Using that data, then one can get a general coverage area for where the device was most likely to have been at that time.
And when you talk about this program tracks, I think you also mentioned ZX. Is that what it used to be?
Yes, that was the company that initially developed it, I believe.
Is that program only available to law enforcement?
No, it's my understanding that it's available to paying customers who want to use it for various purposes. I'm familiar with instances where it's been used by defense and people doing private analysis.
In your experience, do cell phone companies use technology that looks for the best signal?
Typically. So as I mentioned before, you may start a call in one place and you either may move or you may not for one reason or another. During the course of that call, your device could switch to a different tower because the signal's better. Environmental conditions can impact signal strength, line of sight, obstructions in the environment, and then again, when we move and our devices move with us.
And to be clear, when we talk about the location of a device, that's the cell phone itself, not necessarily the person it's associated with. Is that correct?
Correct. Call detail records can tell you information about where a device most likely was at a given moment. The question of who's holding the device is something that must be examined or determined from context or other means.
And we've talked about in this particular case, you were given some phone records to review.
Yes,
Do you recall what you looked at in this case?
I do.
And what was that?
So there were records of 4 different phone numbers, again, between Verizon, T-Mobile, AT&T, that were attributed to various people involved in this investigation. Again, I did not write the warrants to obtain that data. I was just given the data after it had been obtained.
When you're provided phone records, what are you looking for?
So typically, what I want to determine if there are claims that have been made in this investigation or are relevant to the investigation that could possibly be tested by the data set that I've been given. There are certain questions that your cell phone data set might be able to answer and certain questions that they cannot. So if, for example, someone said that in a room with just the two of you there, you said a particular thing, I'm unlikely to find an answer to that in your cell phone data records. It's not likely to be there. But as far as analyzing when and where people tended to be, or if they were in fact communicating without necessarily knowing what they communicated about, those are things that one can evaluate. So you look at the records and try to determine by looking at them if there are reasonable conclusions that can be reached from what's in that data set that would be relevant to your case.
And in this case, did you prepare an exhibit of the information you reviewed?
I did.
And was the information you reviewed extensive?
Yes,
Do you feel that the exhibit would aid you in your testimony today?
it would.
Do you feel it would aid the jurors in understanding the evidence you're going to talk about?
I do believe it would.
Your Honor, I have what's been marked as State's Exhibit 43. However, I had talked with counsel in the court before. I have it plugged into my laptop ready to play. It does take a minute to upload. Counsel has been provided a copy. I would ask to publish at least the first slide of it for identification purposes.
Okay. If there's no objection, then we'll go ahead and permit you to publish that first slide. And I'll note also, we did provide time for defense counsel to review this on the break. So you can do that, Ms. Blake.
And I will indicate there should be a mouse up on the stand for the detective to use as we get further.
I think also we would have the option here to just put that on the witnesses monitor and not publish to the jurors. Is that preference yours?
For identification purposes, the first slide does not contain much information. It does contain some phone numbers, however, that were analyzed.
Okay, well, we can just go ahead and publish that on the big screen then also, and I don't think that would be a problem if the jurors viewed that.
And Detective Werther, do you recognize the slide we're seeing on the screen?
I do.
Was this in fact prepared by you?
It was.
And did you and I meet yesterday to review the exhibit as well?
Yes.
And was it an accurate copy of what you created?
Yes, that's right.
Your Honor, I would move for the admission of State's Exhibit 43.
Any objection?
There's no objection, Judge.
Oh, very well. Exhibit 43 is entered, and as it's an electronic type exhibit, Ms. Blake, if you could just describe a little bit for the record what the exhibit is.
Yes, Your Honor. The exhibit is a PowerPoint. I believe it contains approximately 128 slides. I know it's 120 something slides, as well as a few embedded things as well.
Okay, thank you.
And Detective Werther, on this first slide, do you see some phone numbers listed?
I do.
And you previously mentioned that you looked at call detail records for 4 numbers.
That's right.
Are those the 4 numbers that you looked at detail records for?
Those are the 4 numbers. And then that last item mentions Charles Vallow's phone extraction. That's because, as I mentioned before, that's data taken directly from the device, not from a cell phone service provider.
And as we start moving through this, what are we seeing? Actually, let me back up. What records were you given? Are those what were depicted on the first slide?
Yes, and the slides that follow will show them.
What are we seeing on this first slide?
This is just to orient the viewer or the reader that my analysis pertains to Chandler Police Department's investigation numbered 2019-83744, a shooting investigation in the city of Chandler in Arizona that occurred on July 11th, 2019. This is a CAD call. CAD call is a computer-aided dispatch call, which is what's sent to the officers to notify them they need to go to a place for a particular reason. And it shows the time that the call to 911 was received was 8:36. And a dispatcher or a call taker entered the initial comments here, RP shot brother-in-law. This call was made by Alex Cox.
And what would RP stand for?
Reporting party.
And if we move to the next slide. And on this slide, what are we seeing here?
This represents the records that I was given and that I used in this analysis for a particular phone number, that phone number being 808-755-5452, which is a Verizon number. And when it was given to me, it was attributed to being a phone used by Lori Vallow.
And if we move forward, and what are we seeing on this slide?
This is the same sort of breakdown, and I should have mentioned each of those line items that one reads on these slides. Those are the titles of the documents I was given pertaining to the particular record. So this is a T-Mobile phone number, 480-692-9562, also attributed to Lori Vallow.
So this is a second device attributed to Lori Vallow that you looked at.
Correct. And one thing I noticed, and I've noted it here when I received these records, no logs of text messages were received, received by me. Ordinarily, your call detail records include not only the voice calls that you make and receive or that your device makes and receives, but also any text messages sent. For whatever reason, and I don't know what it is, I did not receive text message logs pertaining to this number.
And then if we move forward, what are we seeing on this slide?
This tells you of the records from Verizon for number 480-351-9120, attributed to Alex Cox, and again, a listing of the documents that I received for this analysis.
And then if we move forward from there, what are we seeing on this slide?
This is a listing of AT&T documents pertaining to number 515-402-0143. And when I was provided these records, I was told that they were attributed to Chad Daybell.
And when you looked at these particular records, did you notice who it appeared that the phone attributed to Chad Daybell had been in contact with?
I did notice various communications between this and primarily one other number on the day in question.
And what other number was that?
The primary number was one of the two numbers attributed to Ms. Lori Vallow. It's shown throughout the slides as to which of those two particular numbers it was.
And when you talk about on the day in question, what specific day did you look at these call details for?
I mostly limited my analysis to the day of the shooting in Chandler, as that was my task to analyze what these records could tell us about that particular event. So that previously mentioned July 11th of 2019.
And then if we move forward, you'd previously mentioned that you looked at the locations extracted from Charles Vallow's phone. Is that correct?
Correct.
Did you look at any other data in relation to Charles' phone at that time?
No.
And can you remind us again or explain the difference between the records for Charles' phone versus those for Lori, Alex, and Chad?
Yes, so all of the four numbers that we've gone through, those are records. As I mentioned, a warrant was sent to a cell phone service provider, and then they provided in return various records related to their customer and that particular device and what it was doing during the time frame authorized. This is different in kind. This is data extracted from Mr. Vallow's mobile device. And that data, as I understand, is primarily sourced from GPS, which is a different system than when your device is communicating with a cell phone tower.
And if we move to the next one, what are we seeing on this slide?
So this is to help orient the viewer to how this is going to be represented, this data from Charles' device. So we have the ability at the department, I'm not one of the people who does it, to extract data directly from someone's device. And then that data produced as a spreadsheet that was given to me can be mapped. GPS coordinates, same as we all use if you've ever used a mapping device on your phone to be able to get from one place to another. That sort of data is the type of data we're talking about. And in the presentation, the data from the phone extraction for Charles Vallow will be represented as points, as you see on the screen, in red. And that point represents the latitude, longitude that was extracted from the device.
And the red specifically will be in reference to Charles Vallow's phone?
Correct. I've color-coded the individuals associated with their devices, so that it helps the viewer to keep track of which device we're looking at a given point.
And if we move forward to slide 10, what are we seeing on this slide?
This is to help, again, orient what you're about to see. These are cell site markers. So we have Verizon, AT&T, T-Mobile up on the screen. And when a cell site or a cell tower was indicated in the records as having communicated with the given device, they've been color-coded. So blue for Lori Vallow, yellow for Chad Daybell's device, and green for Alex Cox's device. And the tower will be represented by that color-coded pin.
And if we move forward to the next slide, what are we seeing on this slide?
This slide again shows the various devices, and it shows the color coding of what's known as an H-plane, which I'll discuss in more detail on the next slide, but it shows that that color coding will be maintained for those as well.
And then if we move to slide 12. And I think you said you discussed the H-plane a little bit more. Can you explain what we're seeing on this slide and what the H-plane is?
H-plane is short for horizontal plane. And as I mentioned before, towers have sectors, and the records indicate a device communicated with a particular sector. So as you see, that black dot is the location of the cell site with which the device was communicating. And the line is the azimuth, or the direction that the antenna was oriented on that sector that the device communicated with. This particular shape is an estimate of how the radio frequencies that are broadcast from that particular sector would propagate. So testing that's been done in a thing called an anechoic chamber, which is basically a room, the purpose of which is to dampen sound and radio frequencies, to dampen their reflection off of objects and so forth, has allowed engineers to determine approximately the shape in which those radio frequencies are broadcast from a particular sector. Now, that would be under laboratory circumstances. The real world is not a laboratory circumstance. So this is a representation of what one would expect in a laboratory from the performance of that sector. It's important to understand this is not where you see this color-coded shaded area. This is where the device is most likely to have been for that event, but it is not a claim that the device had to be within that area or definitely was within that area. It's an estimate of a likely location.
And then if we move forward to the next slide, what are we seeing on this slide?
This is again to orient us to what we're going to view throughout most of the exhibit. So in producing the exhibit using Google Earth Pro with processed records that can be mapped and viewed in Google Earth Pro, there's certain features that one should be aware of. This top thing in Google Earth Pro is known as a timeline slider bar, and it allows one to move forward and back in time through the records and indicates at what point in time one's currently looking. Then this shaded area, as I mentioned before, is the estimated device location for one of the devices mapped in blue. This one is for one of the devices mapped in green. If you have multiple devices, they'll both be on the screen at the same time with their estimated locations. And then the red points there is an estimated location of the extracted GPS data from Charles Vallow's phone.
And what are we seeing on this next slide?
Just in order to reduce clutter on the screen, I've used shorthand. In this case, everyone has different initials, so that seemed a reasonable way to do it. So where you see CV, that refers to Charles Vallow. Where you see LV, that refers to Lori Vallow. CD refers to Chad Daybell, and AC refers to Alex Cox with their various color coding, again, just to reduce clutter.
And then what are we going to see on these next slides?
These next slides will start bringing us into representations of the actual analysis of these various records when they're all put together.
And, what are we seeing on this slide?
Yes, thank you. So this was, as mentioned before, I provided some of this information on July 11th, 2019, 8:36 a.m. Chandler police received the 911 call regarding a shooting alleged to have been in self-defense at 5531 South Four Peaks Place in Chandler. Police officers responded. They contacted Alex Cox at that location and found Charles Vallow inside deceased with multiple gunshot wounds. And during the course of the investigation, Lori Vallow returned to the scene at 8:48 in the morning with her daughter, Tylee Ryan. Interviews were conducted with the various people involved, and then cell provider location data, as we've discussed, was later obtained, and the cell phone location data was extracted from Charles Vallow's phone.
And if we move forward, what does this slide depict?
As I mentioned before, when you have a certain amount of information about a case and then you have the data set, the question is, what can that data set possibly tell me? Does it support the claims? Does it refute the claims? Or does it tell me nothing about the claims? These are some of the things that I noted that seemed like they could be tested by looking at the data. So some of these claims include things like the particular time that Charles Vallow was said to have arrived at the South Four Peaks Drive location. The question of whether Lori Vallow was or was not present at the time of the shooting, whether she did in fact end up with his cellular phone after the shooting, which is a claim that was made, whether the children were present, and then events after the shooting. The claim had been made by Lori that she went to a nearby Burger King and that she went to a drugstore to buy flip-flops for herself and the children. She said they had to leave without shoes because of the event, and that she dropped JJ off at Lauren's Life Academy, which is a school that he attended, and then returned after doing all those things. And one other thing is she had made the claim that Alex called Lori after the shooting, and they discussed whether he would call 911 or not.
So those are all things that you felt you could try to verify or disprove in looking at the various events and timeline given?
Yes, these seem like things that cell phone estimated locations and also communication records should be able to at least give some indication of whether these things were supported or refuted by the data.
And if we move forward, were you looking to corroborate or find something that would refute some of the information provided?
Yeah, so specifically with reference to the cell phone, the call detail records from the various providers and also locations on Charles's phone, it's important not to take those things at case value and say, well, the data says that the device was there, so it absolutely had to be there, because the data has an error rate. All data has an error rate. So one of the other things we try to do when we're doing investigations is find other means of corroborating or refuting the data. Because if the data are not accurate, we want to know that. And so we are looking for other things that might show. And throughout the presentation, I try to intersperse some of those things that we found.
And regarding the records you received, what is the first thing you did with the records?
The first thing that I did with the records when I received them is look through the actual raw records and see what sort of records even I had been given. And notice certain things like, again, the lack of text detail for Lori. And so I asked if that was somewhere else and determined that for one reason or another, and I don't know why we don't have it. So after looking through the records, I used that program we discussed previously to produce a file that can be viewed in Google Earth Pro so that I can put all of the various data sets alongside one another in a timeline, mapped, and then move through them and see what each of the data sets indicates about what the device was likely doing during that time.
And again, was your analysis restricted to the events of July 11th of 2019?
Yes, it was.
Were the records set to a specific time?
Yes, because we were investigating an incident in Arizona, they're all interpreted in Arizona. Typically, when they provide the records from the subscribers, they're going to set them to GMT, Greenwich Mean Time, also known as Zulu time sometimes. Arizona is always 7 hours behind that. So all of these records are set to GMT -7. And that includes the records for Chad Daybell, which indicate that, in fact, he was in Idaho at the time, which is a different time zone. But in order to be able to see them all as they actually happened, I set his records to Arizona time. Otherwise, what you would see is all the Arizona events, and then 1 hour later, you'd see an Idaho time event that in reality had happened 1 hour earlier. It would be
And if we move forward, is this an animation you created?
yes.
And can you explain what we're seeing here?
The purpose of this animation is to orient the viewer to the general areas that are going to be involved in this analysis. So that's the Phoenix metro area. Chandler is on the left-hand side. You'll see the map pop up again as the data loads. And then certain areas of particular interest to the case are being labeled as we watch for reference to get you a general idea of where they're all located.
And there's a residence there. It looks like a house icon.
Yes.
What does that represent?
The one on the left side of the screen, because I've used two house icons, the one on the left is 5531 South Four Peaks Place, which is the incident location of the shooting. And I should mention, although it's likely obvious, that north is the top of the screen and it will remain so throughout the animations.
And then the other residence that we see there?
That is Alex Cox's residence at, oh, that should not have done that. Alex Cox's residence at 1658 East Shari Street in Santan Valley.
And there are some other
Yep, Santan Valley.
And there are some other icons there. Are we going to talk more about those a little later?
We will talk about those locations as they come up.
And if we move forward,
Yes, I think we should. Oh. There we are.
and what are we seeing on this screen?
This is an estimate of the distance from the 5531 South Four Peaks Place address to a Burger King that wound up becoming an area of relevance, and the estimated distance is 1.96 miles.
And if we go to the, and is that the measurement that was depicted on that screen?
That is the measurement depicted on that screen, yes.
And on this next one, what are we seeing here?
This is an estimated distance from the Four Peaks Place address to Lawrence Life Academy, which, as I previously mentioned, is the school that JJ attended at the time. The measurement depicted on the screen is an estimate that says 7.2 miles.
And if we move to the next one, what are we seeing here again?
This again is that CAD call hard copy showing that the 911 call was received at 8:36.
And if we go to the next slide, did issues of timing and what was reported as far as times cause concern early on in the investigation?
Yes, we pretty quickly noticed there's an issue of plausibility as far as the timeline. If the 911 call was received at 8:36, and if Lori returned to Four Peaks at 8:48, which is 12 minutes later, you notice you have to go about a little over a mile to go to the Burger King, and then 7 miles round trip to go to the Academy. Added in the claim that there was a stop at a drugstore, we began to become concerned about a delay in calling 911, which is ordinarily concerning. Ordinarily, if a shooting event happens, 911 is normally called relatively quickly.
And I think I'd failed to ask, did Lori report that she'd stopped at that Burger King
She did.
and then that she'd taken JJ to school?
Yes, and I should clarify, I spoke to her. She told me she stopped at a Burger King. I'm not positive she specified that one.
Was that one on the way to JJ's school?
Yes, I think it's the nearest one, and it's also between the two locations.
And then she also reported stopping at a drugstore?
That's right.
And if we move forward, what do we see on this slide?
This is the first location data point among all the data sets that I had for that day. This is an indication of a GPS location from Charles Vallow's phone, and you'll see right there on the left-hand side, True by Hilton at 1950 South Santan Village Parkway.
And what are we seeing here?
This is an overlay of a receipt that was later recovered when we went to the True by Hilton that indicates that that is in fact where Mr. Vallow was staying on the date in question. So as I mentioned, we're trying to see if data appear to be accurate or not. This does appear to show him at the hotel where he was known to be staying, or his device at the hotel where he was known to be staying.
And in moving to the next slide, what are we seeing here?
So this is a record from the 0143 number attributed to Chad Daybell, where it texts the 9562 number attributed to Lori Vallow. As I mentioned, for that 9562 number, I don't have text logs. So to the extent that I can examine those communications, it has to be viewed from the records produced regarding the 0143 number. And this here would be the estimated location of that 0143 number at the time, which is 6:06 in the morning, Arizona time.
And if we go to the next slide,
This is advancing the time to 6:12 in the morning, and this is Lori Vallow's 9562 number texting Chad Daybell's 0143 number.
and this is again on July 11th of 2019.
That's right.
And if we go to the next slide,
Advancing again to 7:01 in the morning, the Chad Daybell 0143 number texts the Lori Vallow 9562 number. And these are just, again, the mapping estimates associated with each of these communication events for the 0143 number.
and moving forward, what do we see here?
This is starting back at that 0003 GPS event, and it showed the various GPS events all the way up to 0716. If you saw them popping up on the screen and then passing, it would show that they were all generally in the area of that hotel until 7:16 in the morning on the 11th.
And then if we move to the next couple slides,
So at 7:16 in the morning, the device, Charles Vallow's device location data shows it traveling from that Hilton through various streets to the area of the Four Peaks residence. And one of the things I wanted to highlight here, as I mentioned, all data has an error rate. Yes, I do not have any reason to believe that Charles Vallow's phone was actually in the backyard of that neighboring house. There's just an error rate, and that's something to keep in mind when one reviews these things. But it shows it arriving in the area of the Four Peaks residence at 7:32 in the morning.
and the last communication between Chad and Lori prior to this that you noticed was about 7:01 or just after 7 in the morning.
That's right, on that device, yes.
And if we move forward, what are we going to see here?
This is going to show, again, the 0143 number, texting Lori Vallow's 9562 number, and this is at 7:33 in the morning. This is the same approximate time that the device data indicates that Charles Vallow's device arrived near Four Peaks.
And again, we don't have the content of those messages. Is that correct?
I do not have those. If someone has them, I'm not aware of it.
And this is a device associated with Chad texting a device associated with Lori?
That's right. And I'm not familiar with the area, of course, but I imagine those of you up here are more likely to recognize this area.
And if we move forward?
So until 7:50, the data from Charles Vallow's device indicates it was in the general area of the Four Peaks address. Then about 7:50, you see that it has now moved away and out towards the surface street, which is Gilbert Road. So that's approximately 18 minutes after the device arrived near Four Peaks. It is now off and in transit, and about 46 minutes prior to the time when the 911 call will occur.
And you previously indicated it was stated Lori Vallow ended up in possession of Charles' phone?
Yes, that's the claim she made, and that's also how it was later recovered by one of the detectives, was from Ms. Vallow.
And if we, actually, I'm looking at the time. Judge, would you like us to keep going?
Well, I think we ought to go ahead and take the noon recess at this time, Ms. Blake. So we'll go ahead and take lunch. Let's start back up right at 1 o'clock, please.
All right, please.
Please be seated.
Please offer the account for your.
All right, thank you. Please be seated. Okay, we're back on the record on case CR 22-21-1623, State of Idaho versus Chad Daybell. Detective Werthers on the stand. I'll remind the witness you're still under oath for your testimony. And Ms. Blake, you were conducting direct if you'd like to continue. And if you're still publishing the Exhibit 43, you can do that as well.
Thank you. And we may need to go back one screen.
I think more than one. There are a few auto advances, and I think they did their thing while we were away.
And I think this is the slide we left on, correct?
Believe so.
And again, to remind the jurors, what were we seeing on this slide?
This was GPS location data extracted from Charles Vallow's phone, and this represented that at about 7:50 in the morning, the device left the area of the Four Peaks address that we've been discussing. I had mentioned that that's about 18 minutes after the device arrived and about 46 minutes before the call would be made to 911.
And I think we talked about it, but I believe Lori had indicated she had Charles' phone with her.
That is what she had claimed, yes.
And if we go to the next slide.
Okay.
What are we seeing on this slide?
This slide is representing, these are those H-planes we had discussed before, indicating where a device most likely was at the time an event happened. This event is actually a call that should have stayed up. This is a call made between Alex and Lori, between Alex's device and Lori's device, rather, and shows that at 7:52, sorry, the auto advance is going to keep doing that. At 7:52, you can see the devices are communicating, and it shows the most likely location where those two devices were at that point.
So Lori and Alex's device were communicating.
Correct. That was a voice call at 7:52 between the two. Recall the claim had been made that after the shooting that Alex and Lori communicated via phone, and this is one of a few instances I found where there was a voice call between their devices.
And that was before the 911 call.
before the 911 call. We've not got to the 911 call yet.
And then what are we seeing here?
These would be those overlapping H planes. So the blue represents the most likely area for Ms. Vallow's device to have been, and the green is the most likely area for Alex Cox's device to have been. The green, of course, includes the Four Peaks address, and the blue includes the Burger King we're going to talk about momentarily.
All right. And if we go forward,
Yes.
and what are we seeing here?
This is location data derived from Charles Vallow's device, which shows that at about 7:55, it was in the area of that Burger King on Ocotillo Road that we previously highlighted.
And if we go forward, what is this slide telling us?
This is my way of, we talked about wanting to corroborate data and then, or refute the data if it turns out to be the case that the data isn't reliable, and also to test the various claims. So if it is true that Lori Vallow was in possession of Charles Vallow's phone at this point, then that location data in the Burger King parking lot area would also be representative of where Ms. Vallow likely was. That would show the data set were apparently reliable, and it would also show that Ms. Vallow appeared to have the phone. So to test those claims, we look for that evidence. And one of the things I did in order to look for that evidence is go to that Burger King to view that video and see if in fact we saw Ms. Vallow.
And did you in fact do that?
Yes.
And if we move forward, and what are we going to see in these next slides?
So these will be 3 different video clips recovered from the Burger King location. I went there and I viewed them in person, and then they were later provided by the Burger King security personnel. You see the timestamp of 7:54. One of the things I do, and that I did in this case, is while I was at the Burger King, I checked what their video system time thought the time was, and I checked that against my work cell phone, which I know to be reliable, and it showed that their timestamps appeared to be accurate. So the 7:54 is roughly accurate to the time.
And is this particular vehicle one associated with Lori Vallow?
It is. I personally observed this vehicle not the day of the shooting, but the next day. This red Kia Sorento with this particular Colorado plate that you see up on the screen. I went to the Four Peaks address on the 12th and I saw that vehicle. And just for reference, I think I've enlarged the area where the plate is to show that it seems to be generally consistent with those characters.
And do you recall learning that Lori indicated she'd heard the shot,
That's what I was told, yes.
and yet she's at the Burger King at approximately 7:54,
That's right.
and the 911 call does not come in until about 8:36?
That's right.
And then if we go forward,
Video from the drive-through that momentarily will show a person that I recognize as Ms. Lori Vallow, having seen her in person.
and from this video, could you tell who was in the vehicle with her?
I can tell that there's at least one other person in the vehicle. I personally can't see that person clearly enough to say who that person is.
And were you aware that Lori indicated she'd left the residence with both of her children?
That's right.
And do you recall the approximate distance from this Burger King and the residence Lori was residing at the time?
I said it earlier, it was 1 point something miles. I don't recall what followed the decimal,
Fairly close distance then.
relatively.
And again, according to Lori, she'd already heard the shot. So at this time, according to Lori, Charles was already shot.
According to her claim, yes,
And she's at a Burger King drive-through.
correct.
And what are we seeing in this slide?
This is the video from the drive-through after the order's been accepted, and it'll show the vehicle leaving at 7:55 a.m.
And was this consistent with where Charles' phone location showed his phone?
That's correct.
And what are we seeing on this slide?
This just goes back to that claim. So now we have, if we see Lori there, we see Charles's phone puts the phone location data in that general area. So this would suggest that the claim that she had the phone is supported by this evidence.
And if we move forward, what are we seeing here?
This is going to be another call, I believe, between Alex Cox's phone and Lori Vallow's phone, and also location data extracted from Charles's phone. And as the animation continues, there will come a point where the H plane from the phone call for Lori Vallow will be overlaid, I believe. Yes, there it is. And you'll see, as I mentioned before, the H plane is where the device is likely to have been. And then Charles Vallow's GPS data also is within that H plane. So those devices are indicated to have been in the same general area. And there is Alex's H plane in green, showing an area that does include the Four Peaks address. And these are the details for each of those calls coming up on the screen now.
And if we move forward,
So the claim had been made that Ms. Vallow stopped at a drugstore to buy flip-flops or sandals for at least for herself and at least one of the children. This is location data from Charles' device showing it arriving at around 8:08 in the area of a Walgreens on Lindsay. It does not stay for very long, and then actually is going to go to a different drugstore, also Walgreens, I believe. This, I believe, is at 8:16. That'll come up in a moment at a Walgreens on 785 South Cooper. Yes, that's 8:16. And these are the location data from Charles's phone again.
and again, she's at a Walgreens prior to any call being made to 911.
Call to 911 has not yet been made.
If we continue,
So that slide is redundant, sorry. This would be the video that I recovered from that Walgreens, showing that at 8:16 on their timestamp, Ms. Lori Vallow walks in. And there's the register view of her buying the sandals as claimed.
and did this match up with the location data on Charles' phone?
Yes, again, everything has an error rate, but the device is in the area of this Walgreens at the same time,
And again, this is presumably after Charles has been shot, according to Lori.
according to Lori.
And again, prior to the 911 call being made.
Correct. So now we're at 8:20 and the video shows Ms. Vallow walking out.
And then what are we seeing here?
This is the location data from Charles of the device again, picking up over by Gilbert Road and then transitioning down towards the Lawrence Life Academy. You see that one data point that's in the area of the academy in the parking lot. And that data point's details will come up in a moment, and I believe it's 8:20 in the morning. Oh, sorry, 8:32. My apologies.
And again, Lawrence Academy is where JJ was attending school.
That's right.
And if we move forward, what are we seeing here?
This is going to show Charles Vallow's device location at the time that the 911 call was placed by Alex Cox. So that's the device location in red on Gilbert Road, north of the freeway. And that is the H plane for the 911 call made from Alex's Cox device, which initiated the police investigation in this matter. And this, for reference, is about 63 minutes after the device location data from Charles's phone first arrived in the area of Four Peaks in the morning.
If we move forward.
This brings us back to that CAD call, showing again that it's 8:36, just so that we're oriented. We're back to that point that I brought us to earlier.
And if we go to the next slide, what are we seeing here?
This is going to be the phone location data from Charles's device in transit down towards the Four Peaks address. There's a point just north of the freeway right now. And then it should pick up and show it arriving in the area of Four Peaks. This is the detail for one of those data points, showing that it's about 8:49 in the morning that you see the device is now in the area of the Four Peaks address.
And did that correspond with the time Lori arrived back at
It-
that residence?
It did.
And if we go to the next slide, what are we seeing here?
So this is taken from Officer Krautheim's body-worn video, and one sees Lori and Tylee arriving, and I noticed that the flip-flops do appear similar to the ones that we just saw purchased, so I've highlighted those. And then because the way he had his camera oriented, I have to turn the timestamp over for it to be read. And this is represented in Zulu time, which is also GMT. So you subtract 7 hours, you get 8:48 in the morning Arizona time. So again, the data from Charles' device is once again corroborated by something independent, in this case, the officer's body-worn video.
And if we move forward from here, what are we seeing?
This is more data corroboration. So there is an incoming call to Charles's device at 10:25. And the center of the screen where I've labeled Chandler PD, that's where the Chandler Police Department main station is. So what I did to check that is if he was at the main station, there would be evidence of that. And I see that at 10:25, there's Alex in one of the interview rooms.
And there's an indication that it was a missed call from M. Boudreau.
Right.
Do you know who that is in reference to?
I'm aware that that person's related to this case. I'm not fully aware of the facts of their involvement.
And would it be Melanie Boudreau?
That's right.
And if we go forward from here,
This is another incoming call, 10:26, again showing the H plane does cover the area of the Chandler Police Department. And to corroborate that, there we are at 10:26 with Alex in the interview room.
and it shows a missed call from an S. Shiflett. Do you know who that was in reference to?
Yeah, I think the name is Summer Shiflett.
Do you know if she's Alex Cox's sister?
I believe that's right.
And this is Alex in an interview room?
Yes.
If we go to the next one. What are we seeing here?
This shows that at about 10:40, that's Detective Nate Moffett there. He's returning some items to Alex, and that includes Alex's cell phone. So we've been seeing those missed calls and the indication the device was in the area of that H plane, and there is the device.
And I think you said 10:40. Would it have been approximately 11:40?
Yes, thank you.
And if we move forward from here, what are we seeing on this slide?
This is an incoming call to Alex's device at 12:10, and the H plane once again covers the Four Peaks address.
And if we go forward from here, what are we seeing?
This is going back to the location data for Charles's device. That was the location data from the point at 8:49 when it arrived back at Four Peaks, all the way to 12:13 where we see it depart the area of Four Peaks.
And Charles Vallow has been declared deceased by this time.
Yes, that's right.
If we go forward, what are we seeing here?
This is going to show the movement of the location data from Charles's device north and east to an area by the freeway. And it will show a voice call with Lori Vallow and shows that the H plane again is overlapping the area where one sees GPS location data from Charles's device. And you see that those are within 2 minutes, really a little bit less than 2 minutes of one another. There's a 12:34 and 12:36 on those, showing that they're in the same general area at the same time.
And if we go to the next slide, what are we seeing here?
This should show a text from the 0143 number we've been considering attributed to Chad Daybell to Lori Vallow's 9562 number. And this is mapping the location data for that event from Mr. Daybell's records indicating that his device is now in the area of Salt Lake City, Utah.
And did you determine an approximate time on that text?
Yes, it's showing 12:39 on the slider, and I think the actual record's going to come up here momentarily and show that. Yes, 12:39.
And again, were you able to look at the content of that message?
That's not available to me.
And if we move forward,
Maybe frozen, standby. It's not reacting on my end. Do you have the actual computer?
and hey, I'm also not getting any reaction.
That's less than ideal.
Your Honor, if we may take a momentary recess.
Yes.
And Detective Werther, is it going to be best if I close out and
I would-
reopen it?
Be my best guess. If you hit escape so we're not presenter viewing, we'll see if we can note what slide we were on. That'll make it easier. But if it's not reacting at all, I think we'll have to just quit it and reopen it.
And I think it has frozen up. Your Honor, I'm going to unpublish it.
Okay.
And I believe it may take about 5 minutes to get it back up and running if we want to take a stretch break.
Okay, we can, yeah, we'll go ahead and do that.
Okay, I think we are back up and running.
All right.
Thank you for your patience. Detective Werther, I think I went back a slide, but you'd been talking about a text between Chad and Lori's device.
That's right.
And
Okay.
then what do we see on these next slides?
So briefly as well, I may have misspoken. This is an incoming text from Lori to Chad.
And then if we move forward,
Let's see if it'll advance now. It will not for me. Is there a chance you could hit an enter key or an arrow key?
I'm going to see if I reconnect the mouse if it lets you. No?
Yeah, I'm right clicking and it's coming up with nothing. It should come up with a menu. If you hit enter, will it advance?
Without the HDMI cable it was, let me see.
While you're working on that, I'll just note there is, as an aside, they're doing recarpeting, and that's what you may hear going on. There's furniture and other things being moved around, so that's also why we're gonna have our afternoon end when it does tomorrow. But so I just wanted to make sure no one was concerned if they're feeling or hearing what's going on in the courthouse.
And Your Honor, may we approach briefly?
Yes. All right, Ms. Blake, we discussed proceeding with a different witness right now while you work on the technical issue on this, and I believe the state does have another witness we could call. With that, are you moving to allow this witness on direct to step down and have another witness start direct at this time?
Yes, Your Honor, that would be the state's request.
Okay, any objection to that, Mr. Pryor?
No objection, Judge.
All right, Detective Werther, you'll still be under oath clearly and under subpoena, so don't discuss your trial testimony with anyone during the recess. At some point, you will likely be recalled to continue in testimony with your direct examination, but in order to keep things moving, I'm going to permit a state's another witness to be called at this time.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you.
Your Honor, the state would call Tara Martinez.